The dust settled slowly in the late afternoon sun as Margaret knelt there in the middle of Main Street, her torn dress barely covering what remained of her dignity. The red fabric that had once been her finest Sunday dress now lay in tatters around her like fallen petals from a dying rose. She pulled the rough woolen blanket tighter around her shoulders, trying to hide the bruises that painted her arms in shades of purple and yellow. Her husband Thomas had finally done what the whole town expected him to do. He had taken his drinking and his anger too far this time, and now she sat here exposed and broken for everyone to see. The townspeople stood in doorways and behind curtains, watching but not moving. Their eyes held a mixture of pity and discomfort, as if her pain was something contagious, something they might catch if they got too close. It was easier to look away, easier to pretend they hadn't seen anything at all, but Samuel Henderson didn't look away. The rancher had been loading supplies into his wagon when he heard the commotion. When he turned and saw Margaret there in the dirt, something deep inside his chest tightened like a fist around his heart. He had known her since they were children, had watched her marry Thomas. Against her better judgment, had seen the light in her eyes dim year by year as her husband's drinking got worse. Samuel was a man of few words, always had been. His wife Mary used to tease him about it, saying he hoarded words like some men hoarded gold. But when words weren't enough, when silence became its own kind of cruelty, he knew it was time to act. He dropped the heavy sack of grain he'd been carrying and stepped forward. His boots made soft sounds in the dust as he approached Margaret, slowly like you might approach a wounded animal. His shadow fell across her and she looked up, her green eyes wide with fear and shame. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the afternoon breeze. "Cover me." Samuel nodded once and began unbuttoning his vest. It was his good vest, the one Mary had sewn for him years ago with careful stitches and loving hands. The leather was worn smooth from years of wear, but it was clean and it was his, and right now it was exactly what Margaret needed. He knelt beside her in the dust, not caring about his pressed trousers or his clean shirt. The vest was large enough to wrap around her small frame, and he draped it over her shoulders with the same gentleness he might show a newborn colt. "There, now," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're covered." Margaret's shoulders began to shake as tears carved clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. It wasn't just the vest, though. That was part of it. It was the kindness in his eyes, the way he knelt beside her in the dirt without hesitation, the way he spoke to her like she was still a person worth caring about. The watching townspeople began to shift uncomfortably. Some walked away, shaking their heads. Others lingered, wanting to see what would happen next. But Samuel paid them no mind. His attention was focused entirely on the woman beside him. "Can you stand?" he asked. "I think so," Margaret replied, though her voice shook like autumn leaves in the wind. Samuel offered his arm and helped her to her feet. Moving slowly, they walked together toward his wagon. The townspeople watched in silence as he helped her up onto the wooden seat beside where the driver would sit. Then he walked around and climbed up beside her. "Where will you take me?" she asked. "To my place," he said simply. Mary always kept the guest room ready for visitors. "But what will people say?" Margaret asked, looking back at the faces watching them from storefronts and doorways. Samuel looked at her with eyes that had seen 60 years of life. 60 years of joys and sorrows and everything in between. "Let them talk," he said. "People always talk. Mary used to say that words are just noise unless they come from the heart. Most of what gets said around here doesn't come from the heart." As the wagon rolled down the dusty street, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt safe. Not just physically safe, but safe in the deeper way that comes from knowing someone sees you as worthy of kindness, regardless of your circumstances. The Henderson Ranch sat in a valley about 3 miles outside of town. It was a modest spread with a white farmhouse surrounded by oak trees and a red barn that Samuel had painted just last spring. The vegetable garden that Mary had tended so carefully was still producing tomatoes and beans, even though she'd been gone for 2 years now. Samuel had kept it going partly because he needed the food, but mostly because working in Mary's garden made him feel close to her still. He could almost hear her humming as she pulled weeds. almost see her smile as she gathered the first ripe tomatoes of the season. He helped Margaret down from the wagon and guided her up the front steps. The porch wrapped around 3 sides of the house, and Mary's rocking chairs still sat there waiting. She had always said that a porch without rocking chairs was like a song without words. Inside the house still smelled faintly of lavender from the sachets Mary used to keep in all the dresser drawers. Everything was clean and tidy, just as she would have wanted it. The guest room was at the back of the house with windows that looked out over the garden and the pastures beyond. This was Mary's favorite room, Samuel said as he opened the door. The morning light comes in just right, and you can see the mountains from here. Margaret stepped inside and felt her breath catch. The room was painted a soft yellow color, and the bed was made up with a quilt that looked like it had been stitched with love. Every detail, from the fresh flowers on the nightstand to the soft towels folded at the foot of the bed, spoke of a woman who understood that small kindnesses could make all the difference. "I can't stay here," she said, turning to face Samuel. "This is your home, your memories. I don't belong here." Samuel was quiet for a long moment, looking out the window at the garden where Mary used to work. "Mary and I, we never had children of our own," he said finally. "Not for lack of wanting them, but sometimes life has different plans." She used to say that maybe our purpose was to be the safe harbor for people who needed one, that maybe our home was meant to be a place where healing could happen. He turned to look at Margaret, his weathered face gentle, with understanding. "She would have loved having you here. She would have fussed over you and fed you too much soup and made sure you knew you were welcome for as long as you needed to stay." Margaret felt tears welling up again. But these were different. Tears. These were the kind that come when someone's kindness touches a part of your heart that has been closed off for too long. "What about Thomas?" she asked. "What will happen when he sobers up and comes looking for me?" Samuel's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "Thomas knows where I live. If he wants to talk, he can come talk, but he'll do it sober, and he'll do it respectful, or he won't do it at all." That evening, Samuel prepared a simple dinner of beef stew and fresh bread. He wasn't much of a cook, but he had learned the basics after Mary died. The kitchen felt less empty when there was someone to cook for someone to sit across the table from. They ate mostly in comfortable silence, watching the sun set through the kitchen window. The light turned golden, then orange, then purple, painting the sky in colors that reminded Margaret of better times when she was young and the world seemed full of possibilities. After dinner, Samuel showed her where everything was. The linens were in the hall closet, the extra blankets were on the shelf in her room. If she needed anything during the night, anything at all, she should just call out and he would hear her. "I don't know how to thank you," Margaret said as they stood in the doorway of the guest room. "You don't need to thank me." Samuel replied, "You just need to rest and heal. That's thanks enough." That night, Margaret lay in the soft bed, listening to the sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind in the oak trees, the gentle creaking of the old house settling for the night. It had been so long since she had felt truly safe that she had almost forgotten what it felt like. She thought about Mary Henderson, whom she had known only slightly, a woman who had died 2 years ago, but whose kindness still lived on in this house in the way her husband continued to care for people, the way she would have wanted him to. In the days that followed, Samuel never made Margaret feel like a burden. He went about his daily routine, tending to the cattle, fixing fences, mending harnesses, and she was welcome to help, or not help as she chose. Sometimes she worked in Mary's garden, finding peace in the simple act of nurturing growing things. Sometimes she sat on the porch reading books from Mary's collection. Thomas did come looking for her 3 days later. He arrived drunk and angry, demanding that Samuel return his property. Samuel met him at the gate, preventing him from getting any closer to the house. "She's not property." "Thomas," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. "She's a person and she's made her choice, but she's my wife." Thomas argued, swaying slightly as he spoke. "Being married doesn't give you the right to hurt her." Samuel replied, "You want to talk to Margaret? You can do it when you're sober and when you can promise to treat her with respect." Thomas left cursing and shouting, but he didn't come back. The next week, Margaret heard through town gossip that he had packed up and moved on to California, chasing some rumor of gold in the mountains. "Good riddance," Samuel said when she told him the news, though there was no satisfaction in his voice, just relief that a threat had passed. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret began to find herself again. The woman who had loved to read and garden and laugh at silly jokes began to emerge from behind the walls of fear and shame she had built around herself. Samuel never pushed, never demanded anything from her.